A widow with 5 starving children walked into the most powerful man's ranch in Redstone and demanded a job. No money, no references, no husband to vouch for her name, just nerve. The town laughed. The ranch hands sneered. And the man she asked? He almost threw her off his property. But she cooked one meal, and everything changed. What followed wasn't a love story. It was a war. Against a corrupt town councilman who wanted her children ripped from her arms. Against a community that had already decided who she was. She hadn't decided to lose. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like, stay till the end, and let's begin. The wagon died 3 miles outside of Redstone. Not a dramatic collapse. No broken axle flying through the air. No cinematic crash into a ditch. Just a slow, grinding halt. The left rear wheel had been wobbling since noon, and Evelyn Brooks had been praying it would hold until they cleared the ridge. It didn't. The wheel gave out with a low wooden groan, like something exhausted finally admitting it couldn't go on, and the whole rear end of the wagon sank sideways into the rutted trail, spilling a burlap sack of dried beans across the dirt. Evelyn sat on the bench seat for a moment without moving. She didn't cry. She'd run out of that particular resource somewhere in Missouri. Behind her, inside the covered wagon bed, 5 children shifted and stirred at the sudden tilt. The youngest, Clara, was only 4 years old and had been asleep against her brother's shoulder. She woke up confused, blinking at the crooked angle of the canvas overhead. "Mama?" Clara said. "Are we home?" Evelyn climbed down from the bench. Her boots hit the dirt. She looked at the wheel. She looked at the road ahead, the ridge, the descent, the smudge of buildings visible in the valley below that had to be Redstone. 3 miles. "Not yet, baby," she said. "Not yet." She was 37 years old, though she looked older that afternoon. The sun had done its work on her face over 6 weeks of open road travel. Her dark hair, which she'd once kept pinned carefully at the back of her neck, had long since surrendered to the wind and the dust. She was lean in the way that people who've been skipping meals get lean, not healthy, not athletic, just reduced. Her hands were rough. Her dress was clean because she made it a point to wash it every 2 or 3 days regardless of how tired she was, because she refused to let her children see her give up on the small things. The small things were all that was left. Her husband, Dennis, had been dead for 4 months. Pneumonia, moving fast, taking him in under 2 weeks from first cough to burial. He'd been a decent man and a mediocre farmer, and Evelyn had loved him without illusion. When he died, she didn't pretend it was more than it was, and she didn't pretend it was less either. She grieved him honestly, in private, in the 10 minutes between putting the children to bed and falling asleep herself. Then she'd started calculating. The farm in Indiana was mortgaged. The land wasn't worth the debt attached to it. She had no family left to fall back on. Her parents were gone. Her one brother had moved to California years ago and stopped writing. Dennis's family had never warmed to her, and she wasn't about to go to them with her hand out. What she had was a letter, old, folded, from a woman named Ruth Hadley, who'd been her closest friend before Ruth married a cattleman and moved west. Ruth had written 3 years ago about Redstone, growing town, good land, people with backbone and a need for workers. The letter was out of date, but it was something. It was a direction. Evelyn had sold what she could, paid what she owed, packed what remained into an old wagon she bought cheap from a neighbor, loaded her 5 children, Thomas at 14, Margaret at 11, Samuel at 9, little James at 6, and Clara at 4, and pointed the horses west. That had been 43 days ago. The horses were still alive, which she counted as a genuine miracle. They made it into Redstone on foot, mostly. Thomas led the horses. Evelyn and Margaret carried what they could from the wagon. Samuel and James took turns carrying Clara, who was too proud to be carried by her mother and too small to walk 3 miles without complaint. It took them nearly 2 hours to cover the distance, arriving at the edge of town in the late afternoon with dust on everything and the kind of silence that settles over a family that has run out of words. Redstone was bigger than she'd expected and smaller than she'd hoped. A main street ran straight through the center, wide enough for wagons to pass each other without trouble. There was a general store, a post office, a barber shop, a saloon that looked busy even at this hour, a church, a school building that needed painting, and a scattering of homes and businesses on the side streets. At the north end of town, a sheriff's office stood next to what appeared to be a small courthouse. At the south end, the road widened into a kind of public square where horses were tied and a few men stood talking. People noticed them immediately. A woman alone with 5 children, arriving on foot, covered in trail dust, carrying bags. That was the kind of thing that stopped conversations. Evelyn felt the eyes on her and kept walking. She'd decided, somewhere on the road outside of town, that she would not arrive looking beaten. She straightened her back. She kept her chin level. She made sure her children followed her lead, though Clara was currently draped over Samuel's back like a sack of laundry, which somewhat undermined the effect. She stopped at a trough near the center of town and let the horses drink. She wet a cloth and wiped Clara's face. She looked around and found what she was looking for. A woman sweeping the porch of a dry goods shop. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, crossing over. "I'm new to town. I'm looking for work. Is there anyone hiring around here?" The woman, mid-40s, strong arms, suspicious eyes, looked at Evelyn, then at the children behind her, then back. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, managing a household or a kitchen? I'm a good cook. I'm organized. I work hard." The woman glanced again at the children. "You got a husband?" "No," Evelyn said. "He passed this spring." Something moved across the woman's face. Not quite sympathy, more like calculation. "There's no work for you here," she said. "Not in town, anyhow. Most folks have enough mouths to feed already." "What about outside of town? The ranches might be your best chance. Callaway Ranch is the biggest, out on the eastern road, about 4 miles. Rhett Callaway runs it. Hard man, fair enough. He's had trouble keeping a cook." She paused. "But I'll tell you plain, he's not known for charity." "I'm not looking for charity," Evelyn said. The woman studied her. "No," she said slowly. "I don't suppose you are." She left the children in a small grove just off the main road. Thomas in charge, with strict instructions to stay put and share the remaining cornbread equally, and walked the 4 miles to Callaway Ranch in the early evening. Her feet hurt. She had a blister on her left heel that she'd been ignoring for 3 days. She ignored it for 4 more miles. The ranch was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. It was large, genuinely large, the kind of property that took a full minute to cross the front boundary of. A white-painted fence ran along the road, well-maintained. Beyond it, open pasture stretched to the tree line, cattle grazing in the long evening light. A bunkhouse sat to the left of the main house, which was 2 stories, solidly built, nothing fancy but nothing shabby either. Half a dozen ranch hands were visible, moving between the barn and the bunkhouse, finishing up the day's work. They watched her approach with the open curiosity of men who didn't see many women walk through the front gate alone. She walked to the front door of the main house and knocked. The man who opened it was not what she expected either. Rhett Callaway was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed, though he had the kind of face that was hard to date precisely. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that could have been cut with a carpenter's square. He was wearing work clothes, not dressed for company, and he had a glass of something amber-colored in one hand. He looked at her with sharp, dark eyes that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, that he'd had a long day and wasn't in the mood for whatever this was. "Can I help you?" he said. "My name is Evelyn Brooks," she said. "I just arrived in Redstone. I heard you're having trouble keeping a cook. I'd like the job." A pause. "Who told you that?" "A woman at the dry goods store in town." He looked past her toward the gate. "You walk here from town?" "Yes." "Alone?" "My children are waiting for me in town." Something crossed his face at that. She couldn't read it, but it wasn't warmth exactly. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I appreciate you walking out here, but I'm not in the business of—" "Before you finish that sentence," she said, "let me ask you one question." He stopped, seemed mildly surprised that she'd interrupted him. Most people didn't, she suspected. "When did your ranch hands last eat a proper meal?" she said. "Not thrown together beans, not hardtack, an actual cooked meal." He didn't answer right away, which told her the answer wasn't flattering. "That's what I thought," she said. "Let me cook supper tonight, whatever you have on hand. If it's not the best thing those men have eaten in weeks, I'll walk back to town and you'll never hear from me again. If it is, then we talk terms." Rhett Calloway looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man trying to find the flaw in a business proposition. "The kitchen's in the back," he said finally. "You've got 2 hours." What she found in this kitchen was a minor disaster. The pantry was stocked, more than adequately stocked, actually, because Calloway Ranch was prosperous enough that money wasn't the problem. The problem was that nobody had been managing it. Flour had been left in an open bin and had gone partially to weevil. Onions were sprouting. A large smoked ham sat at the back of the pantry that had apparently been forgotten about completely. A crate of potatoes had 3 that were going soft, which she pulled immediately, and the rest were fine. There were dried herbs in paper packets, some still good, some long since lost their potency. There was lard, good quality, dried beans, cornmeal, a large wheel of hard cheese. She tied on the apron she found hanging by the door and went to work. First, she swept the kitchen floor because she refused to cook in filth. 3 minutes. Then she got the stove fired up properly. The damper had been set wrong, which was why everything cooked here had apparently been either scorched or raw. And while it heated, she started the ham. She trimmed it, scored it, set it with the lard in the big cast iron pan, and moved it to the oven. She picked through the potatoes, cubed them, started them boiling in heavily salted water. She found a jar of dried apples and started them reconstituting in warm water with a scraping of sugar and some of the cinnamon she found in a small tin at the back of the spice shelf. She made a cornbread batter. Good cornbread, the way her mother had taught her, with buttermilk she found in a cool corner of the pantry, which was on the edge of turning but not there yet, and got it into the Dutch oven. The onions she sliced and began caramelizing slowly in lard with the last of what turned out to be a small hoard of brown sugar tucked behind the flour bin. An hour in, she heard boots on the porch outside the kitchen door and a voice. "Something smells different in there." She didn't respond. 20 minutes before she judged the ham done, she started the gravy from the pan drippings, adding flour slowly and working out every lump with focused attention, the way her grandmother had been obsessive about. Good gravy was patience. Bad gravy was impatience. She'd learned that lesson young and never forgot it. When Rhett knocked on the kitchen door and pushed it open, she was setting the table, a long wooden table off to one side of the kitchen that she suspected was where the ranch hands ate. He looked at what was on that table for a moment without speaking. "The men eat in here?" she said. "Usually." "Call them in." Set. There were 11 ranch hands that evening, plus Rhett, plus a young woman named Petra, who turned out to be a sort of general household helper, who'd been doing her best with the cooking until she'd declared herself defeated 2 weeks prior. They filed in with the comfortable noise of men at the end of a workday, expecting something forgettable, and stopped when they smelled the kitchen. The ham came out in thick slices. The potatoes were mashed with cheese and a generous amount of butter she'd found in a covered crock, the kind of mashed potatoes that were unreasonable in their richness and completely correct. The caramelized onions went over everything. The cornbread came out golden, with a crust that cracked when you broke it. The dried apple compote went in a bowl in the center. The table was quiet in a way that working men's tables rarely were. A ranch hand named Denny, who had the look of a man who'd been disappointed by food so many times he'd stopped expecting anything, picked up a piece of cornbread. He bit into it. He chewed. He put the piece down and looked at it, like he was confirming it was real. "Lord," he said quietly. That was all anyone said for a while. Rhett Calloway sat at the head of the table and ate without speaking, which was, she sensed, what he normally did. He wasn't the talkative type, particularly. But she watched him from the corner of her eye, moving between the kitchen and the table, refilling things, and she saw his expression shift, in small ways, over the course of the meal. The sharpness in his eyes softened slightly. He ate 2 full plates. When it was over and the men were drifting back toward the bunkhouse, several of them pausing at the kitchen door to say something. "Thank you, ma'am, and best I've had in months," and one man who just touched the brim of his hat and looked at her with a kind of reverence that was slightly uncomfortable. Rhett remained at the table. He turned the empty coffee cup in his hands. "Terms," he said. "A fair wage," Evelyn said, sitting across from him. "Enough to rent somewhere in town for me and my children. 3 meals a day for the hands, plus I'll manage the kitchen and the pantry, which, with respect, has been an absolute mess. You're losing money to spoilage that you don't need to lose. He looked at her. My children are 4, 6, 9, 11, and 14, she said. They won't be underfoot. My oldest is responsible and the others are well behaved. I will not ask you for anything that isn't part of a fair working arrangement. Where are they right now, Oak? He said. Waiting for me in town. I'll collect them after we settle terms. Another long pause. The cottage on the north end of the property, he said. It's small. It hasn't been used in 2 years. You'd need to clean it out. She understood what he was offering. That would suit us fine, she said. Wage is $14 a month. She didn't hesitate. 16, and I have full authority over the kitchen and the pantry. I'm not looking over my shoulder for approval every time I want to reorganize the flour. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Closer to a man registering that he'd underestimated something. 15, he said. Done, she said. She went back to collect her children in the dark, borrowing one of the ranch horses that Rhett had offered without ceremony, Thomas leading the younger ones up the road to meet her. They arrived at the cottage well past sundown, the children half asleep on their feet. The cottage was small and dusty and smelled closed up, but it had 4 walls and a roof and a real floor. And Clara walked in, turned around once looking at the walls, and sat down on the floor in the middle of the room. Is this ours? She said. For now, Evelyn said. It smells funny. It'll smell better tomorrow. She put the younger ones to sleep on the floor with their bedrolls, because the cottage had 2 narrow beds but nothing else in the way of furniture, and they were all too tired to care. Thomas stayed up long enough to help her beat the worst of the dust out of the curtains and get a small fire going in the hearth, which had a slightly crooked flue but drew well enough. When the children were all asleep, she sat by the fire with her boots off, looking at her blistered heel. She'd won the first part. Just the first part. The next week was a reckoning, not with Rhett Calloway, who turned out to be the least of her problems. He was direct, occasionally difficult, had strong opinions about how his ranch was run, and did not particularly enjoy being told things he didn't want to hear. But he was consistent, and he kept his word, which in Evelyn's experience put him above most men she'd dealt with. He stayed out of her kitchen, which was all she'd asked. When she reorganized the pantry and showed him a written accounting of what she'd found and what she'd thrown out and what she estimated had been lost to waste in the past 3 months, he looked at the numbers for a long time and didn't argue with any of them. I'd like to start placing orders directly with the supplier in town, she said, instead of having whoever's free ride in and buy whatever's available. I can keep a running list. We'll save money and stop running out of things mid-week. He nodded. You'll need to introduce me to the supplier, she said. I'll take you Thursday. That was that. What was harder was the town. She noticed it on her first trip in to collect supplies, the shift in people's manner when they realized who she was. The woman from the ranch, the widow with the children, staying out there alone with Calloway and a bunch of ranch hands. People in small towns fill in whatever story they aren't given, and the story they filled in about Evelyn Brooks was predictable and ugly. She heard it first as whispers. Women on the street who went quiet when she passed, then started up again behind her. She heard it next as a comment, half under breath, from a man standing outside the barbershop as she passed. There's the widow who made herself useful. The emphasis on useful was engineered to sting. She didn't stop walking. What she did was make note of it, the way she'd always made note of things, filed it, marked its importance, set it aside for a moment when it would become relevant. The ranch hands were a different story. Some of them had been skeptical when she arrived, not hostile, just waiting. The way men who've been burned by a situation before wait to see if the new situation is any different. She understood that. What she didn't tolerate was when the skepticism curdled into something less respectful. There was a hand named Wade. Big, slow-moving, the kind of man who'd been told his whole life that his size entitled him to a certain amount of deference. He'd taken to appearing in the kitchen doorway during meal prep, making comments. Small ones at first. Observations about the food that weren't quite complaints but weren't quite compliments. Questions that weren't quite rude but had a certain tone. One morning he came in during breakfast preparation and reached across her work surface to grab a piece of bacon from the skillet. "That's not ready," she said. "Looks ready to me," he said, and kept reaching. She moved the skillet off the heat, turned, and looked at him squarely. "Wade," she said, I have exactly no patience for a man who'd burn his own fingers rather than wait 60 seconds. If you need something, ask. If you can wait, wait. If you do that again, I'll serve you last at every meal until you remember your manners. Do you understand me? He was bigger than her by a considerable distance. He stared down at her. She didn't move. He looked away first. Yes, ma'am, he muttered. She put the skillet back on the heat. Thomas found his footing faster than she'd feared. At 14, he was old enough to work, and he started doing so within days of their arrival, helping with the horses, which he had a natural aptitude for, running errands, making himself useful in the way that ranch operations always needed someone willing to be useful. Rhett paid him a small amount, more token than wage, but Thomas took it seriously and showed up every morning before she'd even started breakfast. Margaret, at 11, took charge of the younger children with a seriousness that Evelyn occasionally found heartbreaking. Her daughter had grown up faster than she should have had to. She organized their days, made sure Samuel and James did their lessons from the old primer Evelyn had brought, kept an eye on Clara, who was fearless and directionally challenged and had already been retrieved from 3 places she shouldn't have been. The first time Clara wandered into the stable and Rhett found her attempting to feed a carrot to a horse twice her size, Evelyn's stomach dropped. She came running, apologies already forming, braced for anger. Rhett was crouched down to Clara's level, showing her how to hold her hand flat so the horse could take the carrot without catching her fingers. He looked up when Evelyn appeared in the stable doorway. She's got no fear, he said. It wasn't quite a complaint. She never has, Evelyn said. I'm sorry. It won't. She'll need to learn which horses to stay away from, he said. He stood. Not all of them are this gentle. He looked back at Clara, who was now patting the horse's nose with the concentration of someone performing surgery. I'll tell Thomas which ones. He walked past her, back toward the barn. Evelyn stood in the stable doorway for a moment. All right, she thought. All right. 3 weeks in, she had the kitchen running at a standard she was satisfied with. The meals were consistent. The pantry was organized. The ranch hands ate well. She'd started making 2 extra loaves of bread every week that she sold in town through an arrangement with the dry goods woman, who, it turned out, was named Mrs. Fenton, and was more complicated than her first impression had suggested. Mrs. Fenton had a sharp tongue and strong opinions about most things, but she was also, underneath it, honest. When the bread started selling out within hours of Evelyn's Thursday deliveries, Mrs. Fenton told her so directly. People are asking where it comes from, Mrs. Fenton said. What do you tell them? Cowboy Ranch. The cook. She paused. You should know there's talk. I know about the talk, Evelyn said. Do you know who's behind it? She didn't at that point. Harold Mercer, Mrs. Fenton said. He's on the town council. Was for a long time the man who made things happen in Redstone. Cowboy Ranch is the biggest operation in the county, and Mercer's always had ideas about it. She folded her hands on the counter. He doesn't like you being there. He doesn't like the arrangement. There's nothing improper about the arrangement, Evelyn said. I know that, Mrs. Fenton said. Harold knows it too. That's not the point. The point is what it looks like, and what Harold can make people believe. She held Evelyn's gaze. He's not a man who takes kindly to situations he can't control. Evelyn thought about this on the 4-mile ride back to the ranch. She thought about it when she started supper. She thought about it when Clara climbed into her lap that evening and fell asleep there, heavier than she looked, her breathing slow and steady against Evelyn's collarbone. She'd survived a mortgage, a husband's death, 6 weeks on the road with 5 children and a wagon that eventually gave out. She'd survived being turned away and whispered about and looked through. Harold Mercer. She filed the name away carefully. She'd need it later. The month turned. The days shortened slightly, the mornings getting cooler in the way of a frontier autumn that didn't ease into itself but arrived bluntly. She started making hearty stews to go with the bread, and the ranch hand stopped complaining about mornings. Rhett Calloway remained largely himself, present, occasionally difficult, more observant than he let on. She noticed him watching the operation of the ranch kitchen the way he watched everything else on his property, with the quiet assessment of a man accounting for whether things were working as they should. When they weren't, he said something. When they were, he said nothing, which she came to understand was the same as approval. They had their first real argument in the 4th week, over the matter of the ranch's supply account with the general store in town. Evelyn had found a discrepancy, money being charged for goods that either weren't being delivered in full or weren't being ordered for the kitchen at all. She brought it to Rhett with the numbers written out. He looked at them. "Where'd you find this?" he said. "The receipt book. In the kitchen drawer. Those receipts are supposed to be kept in the office." "They were in the kitchen drawer. I found them while I was cleaning." A pause. "You go through my papers?" "I went through the kitchen drawer," she said, with a precision that didn't quite conceal her irritation. "I wasn't in your office. I wasn't touching things that weren't in my domain. But these receipts relate directly to kitchen supplies, and when I noticed the discrepancy, I thought you'd want to know." "I'll handle it." "I know you'll handle it. I'm telling you so you can." He looked at her for a moment, then at the paper. $15 off, he said. "Over 3 months." "That I could find," she said. "There might be more." He nodded, slowly, set the paper down. "Thank you," he said. It cost him something to say that, she could tell. Not because he was ungrateful, but because gratitude required acknowledging someone had done something useful for you, and acknowledging usefulness in others didn't come naturally to a man who was used to being the most competent person in any room he walked into. She understood the feeling. Cheat. The last thing that happened that first month was the arrival of a letter. It came through the post office and was delivered to her by Thomas, who'd ridden in with the weekly supply run. It was addressed to her in a handwriting she didn't recognize, precise, formal, the kind of handwriting that announced itself as official before you even opened the envelope. She opened it after supper when the children were settled. The letter was from the office of the county court. It was brief. It noted in formal and thoroughly detached language that a petition had been filed by a concerned citizen of Redstone regarding the welfare of 5 minor children currently residing at Callaway Ranch in the care of one Evelyn M. Brooks, widow, and that a preliminary inquiry would be conducted. The language after that was legal and dense, but she read it 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. Someone had petitioned the court to investigate whether her children were being properly cared for. She put the letter on the table. She sat there a long time. Clara was asleep. James and Samuel were arguing quietly about something in their bunk room, the kind of low-stakes argument that resolved itself. Margaret had been reading by firelight. Thomas was outside. She could hear him in the yard. Evelyn looked at the letter. Harold Mercer. The name, filed carefully 3 weeks ago, had become very relevant indeed. She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and placed it on the shelf above the fireplace where she kept important things. Then she got up and started doing the dishes. Because the dishes needed doing, and because she'd learned in 37 hard years that falling apart was a luxury she had never once been able to afford. She washed each dish carefully, dried each one, stacked them. She would figure out what came next. She always had. She didn't tell Rhett about the letter. Not right away. That was a deliberate decision, not an oversight. She needed to understand the shape of the problem before she brought it to someone else, because the moment she brought it to someone else, she lost control of how it was handled. And losing control of things was something she'd been doing enough of lately without volunteering for more. So she wrote back to the county court herself, in careful, measured language, acknowledging receipt of the inquiry and requesting the specific name of the petitioner and the specific nature of the concerns raised. She knew enough about legal procedure to know they had to tell her that much. She sent the letter on Thursday when Thomas rode into town, and she went back to work. What she did differently, starting that week, was pay closer attention to Harold Mercer. She'd seen him twice in town without knowing who he was. A man in his late 50s, thickly built, with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. He dressed well for a frontier town. He had a way of standing that suggested he was waiting for people to come to him rather than the other way around. He was always with someone. A business associate, a council member, a townsperson who wore the slightly deferential expression of a person in the presence of someone they needed something from. The third time she saw him, she knew who he was, and she watched him more carefully. He was outside the courthouse talking to 2 men she didn't recognize when she rode in with Thomas. He didn't look at her immediately, but when she climbed down from the horse and tied up outside the general store, she felt the moment his attention shifted, The way a room changes when a draft comes under the door. Nothing dramatic, just a slight drop in temperature. She went inside without acknowledging him. "Mrs. Fenton," she said, setting her list on the counter, "tell me what you know about Harold Mercer's relationship with Callaway Ranch." Mrs. Fenton had been expecting something like this eventually. She didn't look surprised. "He made an offer on this land 3 years back," she said, starting to pull items from the shelves. "When old Thaddeus Callaway, Rhett's father, was dying and the ranch was in some debt, Mercer came in with what he said was a fair price. Thaddeus turned it down. Rhett paid off the debt the following year." She set a bag of flour on the counter. "Mercer's never forgiven it." "So this is about the ranch," Evelyn said. "Not about me." "You're the excuse," Mrs. Fenton said plainly. "He's been looking for a way to put pressure on Rhett for years. A scandal attached to Callaway Ranch is leverage. A scandal attached to Callaway Ranch involving a widow and 5 children and questions about impropriety." She paused. "That's a different kind of leverage." Evelyn absorbed this. "Who does he have on the council?" "2 men for certain, probably a third. The judge who'd hear any county matter is a man named Aldridge. He's not in Mercer's pocket, but he's cautious. He goes where the evidence goes." Mrs. Fenton looked at her steadily. "You need to be very clean, Mrs. Brooks. Everything about how you live and how you conduct yourself. No gaps, no ambiguity. Mercer will use anything he can reach." "I know," Evelyn said. "Do you have someone who can speak for you, formally, if it comes to that?" Evelyn thought about it. "Not yet." "You should find someone." She paid for her supplies, loaded the wagon, rode back to the ranch with Thomas, who could feel that she was somewhere else in her head and had the good sense, at 14, to leave her there. The reply from the county court came 8 days later. The petitioner was listed as Harold D. Mercer, citing concerns about the welfare and moral environment of children residing on a working ranch under ambiguous domestic circumstances. The language was exactly as odious as she'd expected, careful enough to avoid saying anything specific, vague enough to mean whatever someone wanted it to mean. She read the letter twice, folded it, put it with the first one on the shelf above the fireplace. That evening, after the children were in bed, she walked up to the main house and knocked. Rhett answered the door with the expression of a man who'd been sitting quietly by a fire and was mildly displeased at the interruption, which, she'd come to understand, was just his default resting face. "I need to talk to you," she said. "It won't take long." He stepped back and let her in. The main house was neat in a spare, functional way. Furniture chosen for durability rather than comfort. A large desk against one wall stacked with papers and ledgers. A stone fireplace that was currently doing solid work against the autumn chill. She'd never been inside before. She noticed a photograph on the mantel. An older couple she assumed were his parents, formal and unsmiling in the way of old photographs, and a rifle mounted on the wall that was maintained with the careful attention of something that mattered. She sat in the chair across from him and showed him both letters. He read them without speaking. When he finished, he set them on the table between them and looked at the fire for a moment. "Mercer," he said. "Yes." "He's been looking for an angle for years." "I know. Mrs. Fenton told me about the offer on the ranch." He looked at her then. Something flickered in his expression at the realization that she'd been gathering information independently, but he didn't comment on it. "What do you want to do?" he said. The question surprised her a little. She'd expected him to tell her what he intended to do, which was how most men operated in her experience. "I'm going to respond formally," she said. "I'm going to document everything about how my children live, their schooling, their health, their routine. I'm going to find witnesses in this community who can speak to my character and my fitness as a mother. And I'm going to make Mercer prove every single claim he's made, because they're lies, and the truth is harder to sustain than lies, so he'll slip up." She paused. "What I need from you is to know that this situation, and whatever it costs in terms of your ranch's reputation, is not going to make you ask me to leave." He looked at her. "Is it?" she said. "No," he said. His voice was flat and certain, the way he said things he'd already decided. "You're doing good work here. I don't cut people loose because someone with a grudge starts making noise." She nodded. She picked up the letters and stood. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. He'd never used her first name before. It was always Mrs. Brooks, said with the clipped efficiency of a man who maintained formal distance as a matter of principle. "I have a lawyer in Colton I've used for ranch business," he said. "His name is Garrett Hale. He's good. I'll send him a letter tomorrow." "I can't pay a lawyer right now," she said. "I didn't say you were paying for him." She stood there. "He's already on retainer for the ranch," Rhett said, looking back at the fire. "This qualifies as ranch business since it directly affects the operation of my household. That's the way I'll frame it." She understood that he was being precise with his language in order to make it easier for her to accept something she wouldn't accept if it were framed any other way. She found she appreciated that more than she might have expected. "Thank you," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Brooks." She walked back to the cottage in the dark. The next morning she made breakfast as usual, and the morning after that, and the one after that. The kitchen didn't stop needing to run because she had problems outside it. She'd learned that early. Life had a way of continuing regardless of your readiness for it, so you either matched its pace or you got left. The weeks that followed were hard in a way that was different from the physical hardness of the road or the early days of proving herself. This was a grinding, low-level hardness, the hardness of being watched, of knowing that every choice she made, every time one of her children was seen in town, every interaction with anyone on the ranch, was potentially being observed and reported back to Harold Mercer or his allies. She held herself to a standard that she privately acknowledged was unreasonable. She made sure the children were always clean and presentable when they went to town. She made sure their lessons were documented. She wrote up a simple weekly record of what they'd covered, what books they used, what progress Samuel had made with his reading and James with his numbers, which were behind where they should have been after 6 weeks on the road. She asked Mrs. Fenton to recommend a woman in town who could attest to the children's condition and manner, and Mrs. Fenton sent her to a schoolteacher named Eleanor Parrish, who agreed, after meeting all 5 children, to write a formal letter on Evelyn's behalf. "Your youngest is either exceptionally bright or exceptionally bold," Eleanor Parrish said, watching Clara attempt to reorganize the books on the schoolroom shelf by color rather than subject. "Both," Evelyn said, with the exhausted certainty of a woman who had been managing that combination for 4 years. The ranch hands, for their part, had largely settled into something Evelyn recognized as grudging loyalty. It wasn't affection. Most of them weren't built for that toward a person they'd known less than 2 months. But it was solid. She'd fed them well and treated them with consistency. And in return, they'd stopped making her feel like a problem that needed to be managed. Denny, the man who'd been first to respond to that initial supper, had become something like a friendly presence. He wasn't a talker, but he was reliable. And he'd twice intervened quietly when younger hands were behaving in ways that required intervening. Once directing a particularly thoughtless comment about Evelyn's situation toward a wall by simply saying, to the man who'd made it, "You done?" in a way that finished the conversation completely. Wade, who'd tested her in the kitchen in the early weeks, had arrived at a different relationship with her entirely. He was not, as it turned out, a naturally difficult man. He was a man who'd been badly managed for a long time and had mistaken indulgence for respect. Once Evelyn had established a clear and consistent set of expectations, he operated within them without complaint. He'd even, on one occasion, come in early to help her carry flour sacks from the supply wagon without being asked. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just said, "Thank you, Wade," and handed him the next sack. The problem continued to build outside the ranch gates. Mercer was careful. He didn't do anything crude. No direct confrontations, nothing that would give her a clear target to respond to. Instead, it was the ambient pressure of a small-town whispering campaign conducted by someone who understood social architecture. The story shifted and evolved. At first, it was simply that Evelyn's presence at the ranch was improper. Then the story grew. She'd arrived with nothing and had essentially maneuvered herself into a situation of security. Then the story found its cruelest form, that she was an unfit mother who'd dragged 5 children across the country on a bad gamble and was now keeping them in a working ranch environment that was no place for children. She heard this version from Mrs. Fenton, who reported it to her with the directness of a woman who believed in knowing the exact shape of bad news. "He's building a case," Mrs. Fenton said. "Not a legal case yet. The court letter is just pressure right now to see how you respond. But if he can get enough people saying the same things, he'll have something that looks like community concern." "What does he actually want?" Evelyn said. "The ranch? Control of it, more like. or enough of a crisis around Rhett Calloway that Rhett makes decisions he wouldn't otherwise make. Mrs. Fenton paused. A man like Mercer doesn't necessarily want the thing. He wants the power that comes from being the person who decides what happens to the thing. Evelyn thought about that for a long time. She'd known men like that. Maybe not on this scale, but the type was recognizable. The man who wasn't satisfied with building his own success and needed to measure it by controlling someone else's. Dennis had had a neighbor like that back in Indiana, the kind who fenced right up to your property line just to be sure you knew where his ended. The difference was that Harold Mercer had real power in Redstone. He had council connections, community standing built over decades, and the kind of reputation that, once it was behind a story, made the story feel more credible than it had any right to. The lawyer, Garrett Hale, arrived from Colton in the third week of October. He was younger than she expected, maybe 32, with a quick, organized mind and the manner of someone who processed information the way a mill processes grain, efficiently and without waste. He sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn and went through everything she documented. "This is thorough," he said, going through the pages. "I've been doing it since I got the first letter," she said. "The school teacher's letter is useful. Do you have anyone else?" "I'm working on it." "You'll need more community voices than you might think," he said. Mercer's argument, if he pushes this to a formal hearing, is going to be environment. The ranch is unsuitable for children. The ambiguity of your arrangement with Mr. Calloway as evidence of moral instability. He set the papers down. None of it is provable, but it doesn't need to be proved in a formal legal sense to do damage if the right people are saying it. "What's the strongest thing I have?" she said. "The children themselves," he said. "Healthy, fed, in routine, being educated, well-behaved by every account. A mother who arrived in a difficult situation and by every observable measure has stabilized it." He looked at her evenly. "Don't give Mercer anything. No irregularities, no incidents, nothing he can point to." "I'm aware," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I'm saying it because sometimes people in stressful situations slip, and you can't afford to slip." She did not slip. What she also did, and this was instinct more than strategy, though it became both, was make herself useful to the wider community in ways that had nothing to do with the ranch. It started simply. Eleanor Parrish mentioned that she'd been struggling to feed her students on cold mornings, that some of them came from families where breakfast wasn't reliable, and that she'd been giving them crackers from her own kitchen, which was not a sustainable situation. Evelyn offered to send a pot of porridge 3 mornings a week, a modest thing, easily managed with the ranch kitchen's capacity. Eleanor accepted. Word got around, the way things did in small towns. A woman named Berta Olson, whose husband worked a small claim 2 miles from the ranch, came to the gate one afternoon with a cracked rib. She'd taken a fall, she said, though the story had the tight quality of something being told at its most simplified. And Evelyn let her in and dealt with the rib and gave her a meal and didn't ask questions. Because sometimes what a person needed was help without interrogation. A family came through town in rough shape, passing through rather than staying, and Evelyn made up a box of supplies, bread, dried beans, some salt pork, that Thomas carried out to the edge of the road for them. She didn't do these things for Harold Mercer. She did them because they needed doing, and she had the means to do them, which was all the reason she'd ever needed for anything. But she also understood what they were doing to the shape of the town's opinion. Not among Mercer's core allies, those people were committed, and she couldn't move them. But there was a middle portion of Redstone that hadn't decided what it thought of Evelyn Brooks yet, and every ordinary act of reliability and decency she performed moved that needle in a direction Mercer didn't want it going. Rhett saw what she was doing, she thought. He didn't comment on it directly. He wasn't a man who explained his observations. But she caught more than once the slight shift in his expression that she'd come to recognize as him updating his understanding of something. They developed, over those weeks, a rhythm of interaction that was entirely functional and occasionally surprising. He was at the kitchen table with a ledger one morning when she came in before dawn to start breakfast, which startled her. She was used to having the kitchen to herself at that hour. "I couldn't sleep," he said, without looking up. "I'm not in your way." "You're fine," she said, and started the fire. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, him with his ledger, her with the breakfast prep, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who'd gotten used to each other's presence, which was its own kind of milestone. "The porridge for the school," he said eventually. She glanced at him. "Yes?" "Take what you need from the kitchen stores. I'll account for it separately." She looked at him for a moment. "You're sure?" "I said it, didn't I?" He turned a page in the ledger. She went back to the fire. "Thank you," she said. He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been him clearing his throat. With Rhett Calloway, those two things were sometimes the same. November came in cold and decided about it. The mornings went from crisp to genuinely biting, and the evenings required real fires rather than courtesy ones. The cattle were moved to the winter pasture. The ranch shifted into its colder weather rhythm, which was less frantic and more deliberate. The kind of work that couldn't be rushed, but also couldn't be ignored. Evelyn added soup to every noon meal and started baking on Tuesdays specifically to have extra for the school and for Mrs. Olson and for the 2 or 3 families she'd identified in the outlying area who had lean winters and quiet pride that made them unlikely to ask for help unless it was offered in a way that didn't feel like charity. She was learning the geography of Redstone's need, who had it, where it was, how it liked to be approached, and she was mapping it the same way she mapped everything else, practically, without sentiment, with the aim of being effective. The second legal letter came from the county court in the first week of November. It named a formal hearing date, January 14th. She was standing at the kitchen counter when Thomas brought it in from town. She opened it, read it, set it on the shelf. "Mama?" Thomas was watching her carefully. "It's all right," she said. "Is it the court thing?" She looked at her son. 14 years old, with his father's height already and her own stubborn jaw, carrying more awareness of their situation than a boy his age should have had to carry. "Yes," she said. There was no point in lying to Thomas. He'd have figured it out in 20 minutes anyway. "What happens now?" "We keep going," she said, "and we get ready." She saw something move across his face, not quite fear, more like the tightening that happens when someone decides to be afraid later and handle the current moment now. She recognized it because she'd been doing it herself for the better part of 4 months. "Okay," he said. He set the rest of the mail on the counter and went back out. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. January 14th, 8 weeks. She could do a great deal in 8 weeks. She went back to work. The third significant development of that month came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. A young woman, maybe 19, 20, showed up at the ranch gate on a Tuesday afternoon and asked, with the careful neutrality of someone unsure of their reception, whether Mrs. Brooks was available. Her name was Naomi Reeves. She was the daughter of a dry goods merchant on the south side of town, slight and dark-haired, with intelligent eyes and the contained energy of someone keeping something pressed down. Evelyn recognized that particular quality. She'd worn it herself often enough. She brought Naomi into the kitchen and gave her coffee. "I heard what Harold Mercer is doing to you," Naomi said. "I wanted you to know I know things about it, about why he's really doing it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Tell me," she said. What Naomi told her was careful, specific, and landed in Evelyn's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Naomi's father had been present 2 months ago at a meeting in Mercer's office, a meeting about the ranch, about Rhett Calloway, about forcing circumstances that would give Mercer legal standing to challenge the ranch's ownership on the basis of a debt he claimed Thaddeus Calloway had owed him personally, a debt that Rhett disputed and had no paperwork to support, but that Mercer believed he could make credible if the right kind of chaos surrounded the ranch at the right moment. The petition about Evelyn's children was that chaos. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about the children. It was about creating a public scandal large enough that Rhett Calloway would be weakened. In reputation, in community standing, in his ability to fight a legal challenge, and Mercer could move. "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn said. Naomi looked at her coffee cup. "My father didn't want any part of it. He was there because Mercer invited him, and he didn't feel like he could refuse. And then he heard what was being planned, and he went home and was sick about it." She paused. "He's afraid of Mercer, but I'm less afraid than he is." "This could be used at the hearing," Evelyn said carefully. "Your testimony." "I know. Mercer would come after your family." "I know that too." Naomi looked up at her. "I've been watching what you've been doing since you came to Redstone. Feeding the school children, helping Mrs. Olson, sending supplies out to families. She was quiet for a second. Nobody's done any of that before. Not like you do it. Like it's just what you do. Not like you're making a point. Evelyn didn't say anything. I can't stay quiet about this, Naomi said. I just can't. Evelyn sat across from this young woman, 19 years old, offering to stand up to the most powerful man in Redstone on behalf of someone she barely knew, and felt the weight of it. I won't put you in that position unless you're certain, she said. And I want you to go home and think about it for a week. If you still want to do this in a week, come back. I don't need a week, Naomi said. I'm asking you to take one anyway, Evelyn said. Not because I doubt you. Because I want you to be sure that you've thought about every way this could go wrong, so that if you do come back, you're coming back with your eyes open. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. All right, she said, a week. She came back in 5 days. Her eyes were open. Evelyn poured her coffee, and they sat down together and started planning. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down across Redstone County. Not a storm, just the season's first reminder of what was coming. It covered the fences and the pasture and the roof of the cottage where 5 children were going about their evening, alive and fed and safe. For now, safe. Evelyn watched the snow through the kitchen window while she talked with Naomi, turning the problem over, looking at its angles, finding its edges. She'd been told, when she arrived in Redstone, that there was no work for her here. She was going to make Harold Mercer regret that she'd found some. Naomi came back 3 more times before December arrived. Each visit followed the same shape. She'd appear at the ranch gate in the late afternoon, tie her horse, come into the kitchen, and they'd sit across from each other at the table with coffee going cold between them while they worked through what Naomi knew and how it could be used. Evelyn had started keeping a separate notebook for it, small and plain, that she kept under a loose board beneath the cot in her room. Not because she thought anyone was searching the cottage, but because the habit of protecting important information was one she'd developed early in her marriage and never lost. Naomi was precise about what she'd heard and careful about what she was inferring, which Evelyn respected. Some people, when they decided to be brave, let the bravery inflate everything around it. They became the hero of a story that gets bigger every time they tell it. Naomi wasn't like that. She said what she knew. She said what she thought. She marked the difference between the two clearly. My father heard Mercer say that the hearing didn't need to go all the way through, Naomi said on her 3rd visit. He just needed to get it far enough that Rhett's name was attached to the mess. That's the phrase he used, attached to the mess. The story doing damage in town is more useful to him than a ruling. So he doesn't necessarily expect to win the hearing, Evelyn said. I don't think he cares whether he wins it. He cares whether Rhett gets hurt by it. Evelyn wrote that down. Which means, she said slowly, that his weakest point isn't the hearing itself. It's the actual motivation behind it, because if that comes out, if people understand what this was actually about, the story stops working for him. Naomi nodded. The question is whether anyone would believe it. That depends on how it's presented and by who, Evelyn said. You can't be the only voice. One witness can be called unreliable. Multiple witnesses with corroborating details become a different problem for him. My father might testify, Naomi said. If he's certain we'll win. I can't promise him that. I know. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. He's not a coward. He's just practical. He has a business, a family. He knows what Mercer can do to people he decides to make an example of. I understand that, Evelyn said, and she meant it without judgment. Practicality wasn't cowardice. She'd made her own accommodations with reality often enough to know the difference. What she was building carefully was not a single dramatic defense, but a structure. The kind of structure that didn't depend on any one piece holding. Garrett Hale had come back from Colton twice more and was satisfied with what she'd assembled. Eleanor Parrish's letter was signed and notarized. 3 ranch hands had agreed to speak, including Denny, who'd been unexpectedly articulate when asked about what he'd witnessed of Evelyn's care for her children, and who'd told Garrett Hale in a flat, unsentimental voice that the kids were fed and clean and behaved, and that he'd worked ranches where children were neglected, and this wasn't that. And anyone saying otherwise didn't know what they were talking about. Garrett had written it all down and told Evelyn it was good. Good isn't the same as enough, she'd said. No, he'd agreed. But it's the direction. Then Rhett proposed. It happened in the 2nd week of December, On an evening when the cold had come down hard enough to make the cottage walls creak, and Evelyn had brought a pot of stew up to the main house because the kitchen at the ranch house was larger and she'd been baking there, and Rhett had been at his desk when she came in, and they'd ended up eating at the kitchen table, which had happened 2 or 3 times before without either of them making it into something. He'd been quiet through most of the meal, which wasn't unusual, but there was a different quality to the quiet. She noticed it but didn't push. She'd learned to let things come at their own speed with Rhett Calloway, because trying to hurry him was like trying to hurry a door that opened inward. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "About the hearing?" "Partly." He turned his fork over on the table. He wasn't looking at her directly, which was the tell. Rhett didn't look away from things unless they were things he hadn't fully decided how to handle yet. "If we were married," he said, "the petition falls apart. A married couple on a family ranch with 5 children. That's not a question of moral environment. Mercer's case is built around ambiguity. Marriage removes the ambiguity." She set her spoon down. He continued, still not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm not a man who does things for show. I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking because I feel sorry for you. I'm asking because this situation has become important to me, and I don't want to see it go wrong because of Harold Mercer." He paused. "The ranch, the children, you." The last word came out separate from the others, with a slight difference in weight that she didn't miss. "It matters what happens." She sat across from him and looked at this man who was, in his own way, being as direct as he knew how to be, which was considerable, and still managing to make a marriage proposal sound almost entirely like a practical business solution, and she understood that this was not cruelty or distance on his part. This was just Rhett. This was how he moved through the world, at a slight angle from other people, expressing things in the language of logistics because the other language didn't come easily. She also understood what she felt about it. "No," she said. He looked at her then. "No?" The word had the quality of something he'd genuinely not prepared for. "No," she said again. Not unkindly, but clearly. "I appreciate what you're offering, and I understand why you're offering it. But I won't do that. Evelyn, I won't save my family by making myself into something I didn't choose," she said. "I didn't come to Redstone looking for a husband. I came looking for work, and I found it. And I've done it well. And if there's a hearing in January, then I'll stand up in that courtroom and make my case as the person I actually am." She looked at him steadily. "If I win that way, it means something. If I hide behind your name and win, it doesn't. Not to me." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know what Mercer might still do," she said. "I've been preparing for it since October." She picked her spoon back up. "I'm not asking you to stop worrying about it. I'm just telling you that this particular solution isn't one I can take." He looked at her with an expression she found difficult to read. She was usually good at reading him by now, but this one had too many things in it. Frustration, possibly. Respect, which coexisted badly with the frustration and seemed to be winning. Something else underneath those that she chose not to examine too closely. "All right," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "That wasn't easy to say." "Don't apologize," he said, with enough sharpness that she understood it genuinely bothered him. "If it wasn't right for you, you shouldn't do it. That's not something to apologize for." She nodded. He picked his fork back up. They finished the meal in a silence that was slightly different from their usual silences. Not uncomfortable, but weighted, like a room after something important has been said out loud and can't be unsaid. She went back to the cottage that night and stood by the hearth for a while without lighting the lamp. The children were asleep. The fire was low. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the back of the property with a long, searching sound. She believed what she'd said to him, every word of it, and she also knew, standing there in the dark, that it had not been an uncomplicated thing to say no to. She lit the lamp. She sat down. She opened the notebook. She had 6 weeks until January 14th. 6 weeks was enough time if she used it right. The storm came in the 3rd week of December with almost no warning. The morning of the 21st started the way most December mornings did, gray and cold, a sky that promised nothing good but hadn't delivered on the threat yet. By noon, the clouds had lowered and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Evelyn, who had grown up in the Midwest and understood what that combination meant, went to find Rhett. He was in the barn with Thomas and 2 of the hands. "There's a storm coming," she said. A bad one. He looked at the sky. Could pass north. It could, she agreed. But the pressure feels wrong. My grandmother used to say you could feel it in your teeth. She paused. I feel it in my teeth. He gave her a look that suggested he found this meteorological methodology questionable. But he looked at the sky again for a longer moment. Start doubling the firewood on the porch, he told Thomas. Then to the hands. Check the cattle fence on the east side and get back before dark. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and started cooking as if she expected to be feeding people who weren't going to be able to go anywhere for a while. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky had gone the color of an old bruise and the wind had shifted, and she knew she was right. She sent Margaret and Samuel to the root cellar under the cottage to bring up everything they had. Extra flour, the remaining salt pork, 2 crocks of preserved vegetables she'd been keeping for worse times, which apparently these were. By 5, the storm had arrived. It wasn't gradual. 1 minute there was wind and an ugly sky. The next there was a wall of snow moving across the pasture from the northwest so dense you couldn't see the fence line 30 feet away. The temperature dropped to something that registered less as cold and more as malicious. The wind hit the main house and the cottage with the specific kind of force that made structures talk back, groaning wood, rattling windows, the chimney making a sound like a poorly tuned instrument. Rhett came to the cottage first, moving through the snow with his head down. The hands are in the bunkhouse, he said, stamping snow off his boots on the porch. 2 of the men who went to check the east fence aren't back yet. Evelyn looked at him. How long? They should have been back an hour ago. Do you know where they'd shelter if they got caught out? There's an old line shack about a mile east of the fence. If they had any sense, that's where they went. But you don't know. No. He said it flatly, the way he said things that bothered him, without decoration, because decoration would have made the worry more visible. Then you need to know whether they made it there before anyone goes out looking, she said. Who else knows where the shack is? Denny, 3 others. Then send word to the bunkhouse and see if anyone's heard anything. Don't send men out in this until you know what you're sending them into. She turned back to the fire. I'll have food ready. When anyone comes in, they need to be warm and fed immediately, especially if they've been out in this. He looked at her for a half second, just long enough to register something, and then was back out the door. What followed was the longest night she could remember since the night Dennis died. She organized the kitchen at the main house, which had more capacity than the cottage. She moved her operations there, and Margaret came with her to help. And Petra, who had been largely sidelined by Evelyn's arrival in the kitchen, but who turned out to be steady and capable in a crisis, came in from wherever she'd been sheltering and took direction without needing to be told things twice. They kept 2 large pots going, one of the remaining salt pork, cut down with potatoes, and the preserved vegetables into a thick hot stew, and another just for hot water, because coffee was what you needed when you'd been in that kind of cold and your hands were shaking. The 2 missing hands made it back at 8 o'clock. They came in through the kitchen door with Denny behind them, all 3 of them white with snow and moving with the careful deliberateness of men whose bodies had stopped cooperating fully. The younger one, a kid named Cale, who couldn't have been more than 20, had his left hand wrapped in a strip of cloth that was soaked through, and Evelyn got him to the fire immediately and unwrapped it without asking permission. 2 fingers, badly bitten by the cold. Not black, not yet, but heading somewhere concerning. Does anyone have arnica? Aloe? She looked around the kitchen. Petra, Denny said. She had some medical stuff from when... Where? Evelyn asked Petra directly. My room, in a tin box on the shelf above the bed. Evelyn pointed to Margaret. Go with her, the tin box. Bring it here. She kept Cale's hand in her own hands, warming it slowly. Not fast, not with direct heat, because she'd seen that go wrong. Had watched a man lose a finger to well-intentioned warming done too fast. Slow, steady. She talked to him while she did it, not about the hand, just talking, because his eyes had that slightly untethered look of someone whose body was running some kind of internal emergency response and needed an anchor. You from around here originally? She said. Nebraska, he managed. I'm from Indiana. We get winters. Not like this, but close. She kept her hands moving. What made you come out this far? Work, he said. Same as everyone. Same as everyone, she agreed. Margaret came back with the tin. Evelyn found the arnica salve and applied it carefully once the hand was warm enough. She wrapped it properly. She put a bowl of stew in Cale's other hand and made him eat it before she let him move away from the fire. Rhett had been in and out of the kitchen through all of this, coordinating with the other hands, checking on the cattle that were in the enclosed barn, going out twice to check the structure of the bunkhouse against the wind. He was operating, she noticed, on pure function, making decisions, directing people, moving continuously. It was what he did when he was worried. She'd seen it enough by now to recognize it. Around 10 o'clock, there was a problem with the bunkhouse stove. The flue had partially blocked, not collapsed, but partially packed with ice, which was cutting the draw and filling the bunkhouse with smoke. The hands couldn't sleep there safely until it was cleared, which meant 11 men, plus Cale, needed somewhere to be until the flue could be worked on. Evelyn looked at the kitchen. At the parlor off the main hall. "Bring them in," she said. Rhett looked at her. "The house has 2 large rooms on the ground floor," she said. "They can sleep on the floor if they have to. It's warmer in here than any alternative tonight." She met his eyes. "Bring them in." He brought them in. She moved through the next 3 hours on something that wasn't energy exactly. She'd used her energy up sometime around hour 2, but was closer to the muscle memory of a person who had been the person holding things together for so long that it had become structural, the way load-bearing walls hold up a house. Not because they're trying to, but because that's what they are. She fed everyone. She sorted out where people would sleep. She checked on Cale's hand twice more and was satisfied it wasn't getting worse. She found extra blankets in a chest in the upstairs hall and had Thomas carry them down. She kept the fires going. She dealt with a brief altercation between 2 of the hands who'd been stuck together too long in close quarters and were getting frayed. She walked into the middle of it, set a plate of bread between them, and said, "Not tonight, gentlemen," in a voice that ended the conversation without requiring a resolution. Clara slept through most of it. James and Samuel were awake late, watching everything with the wide-eyed attention of boys for whom this was the most interesting thing that had ever happened. Margaret was useful. Thomas was indispensable. At some point past midnight, with the storm still hammering the walls but the house holding steady, and everyone inside safe and accounted for, Evelyn sat down on the bench by the kitchen fire. Her back hurt. Her feet hurt. The blister on her left heel, which she'd thought was finally healed, had apparently reopened at some point during the evening. Rhett came and sat at the other end of the bench. He said nothing for a while. The fire was loud in the way that fires get loud when everything else goes quiet. "The flue can be cleared in the morning," he said finally, "when the wind drops. Cale's hand is going to be sore for a while," she said. "He needs to keep it warm and keep the circulation going. I'll write out what to do." He nodded. Another long pause. "You run this better than I would have," he said. It came out with some difficulty, the way true things sometimes did with him. She looked at the fire. "You knew when to get out of the way," she said. "That's its own kind of skill." He made a sound that was the closest he usually got to a laugh. "I mean it," he said. Not as a compliment, as a fact. He turned the empty mug in his hands. "You came here with nothing, and you've built something. The kitchen, the children, the whole—" He gestured vaguely at the house full of sleeping ranch hands. "This." She didn't say anything for a moment. "I haven't built it," she said. "I've managed what was already here. There's a difference." "Is there?" She thought about it honestly. "Maybe not as much as I used to think." The storm pushed against the window above the bench, and the glass shuddered slightly in its frame, and outside the snow was still coming down in a way that made the world beyond the walls feel very far away. "When this is over," she said, meaning the storm, meaning January 14th, meaning all of it, "I want to plant a kitchen garden in the spring, on the south side of the cottage where there's good light. I used to have one in Indiana." He looked at her. "I'd need a fence against the deer," she said. "Nothing complicated, just enough to discourage them." "I'll have Thomas help you build it," he said. "Thank you." "In the spring," he said. "In the spring," she agreed. The fire settled. Somewhere in the parlor, one of the ranch hands was snoring with the commitment of a man fully unconscious. Outside, the storm was beginning, just barely, to lose a little of its fury. Still violent, but fractionally less so, the way terrible things eventually tire even of themselves. Dawn came gray and exhausted looking. The snow had stopped some time before first light, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows a hard storm, the sound of nothing, the world temporarily wrapped and muffled. The ranch hands woke in twos and threes, moving stiffly off the floor, coughing, rubbing their faces. The flue was cleared by 8 in the morning, and the bunkhouse was habitable again by 9. By the time everyone had eaten breakfast, a large, slightly improvised meal of eggs, more bread, and the last of the salt pork, and moved back to the bunkhouse, and Cale had been checked and pronounced improving, and the damage to the ranch had been assessed and found to be less than feared, and the cattle were all accounted for. The morning had turned into something almost clear, cold and white and genuinely still, the kind of morning that follows catastrophe and looks almost peaceful, though what it actually is just very tired. The ranch hands were changed by it. Not dramatically. They were working men, not given to dramatic changes. But something had shifted in the way they looked at Evelyn, in the particular directness of the eye contact when they thanked her. Denny said simply, "You kept your head last night," which from Denny meant something. Even Wade, who had started as her most resistant audience, came into the kitchen that morning to help bring in wood from the porch without being asked, stacking it by the fireplace with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided at some point in the night to stop being a problem. She didn't remark on it. She just said, "Thank you, Wade," the same way she always did. Out across the white pasture, the fence lines were mostly intact. The pine trees at the back of the property were bowed under snow but holding. The cottage roof had held. The main house had held. The people inside had held. In 3 weeks and 2 days, she would walk into a courtroom and stand in front of a judge and a room full of people who had been told a story about her, and she would have to make the truth louder than the story. She had 8 witnesses confirmed. She had Garrett Hale. She had Naomi Reeves and the account of a private meeting in Harold Mercer's office. She had documentation of her children's health and education and daily lives. She had her own testimony, which she'd been going over in her head for weeks, trimming away anything that sounded like pleading and keeping only what was exact and factual and clean. She was not ready. She didn't think she'd feel ready even the morning of, but she was as prepared as she could make herself, and in her experience, those two things were rarely the same, and you had to make peace with the difference. She went back inside. She started lunch. 3 weeks. The 3 weeks between the storm and the hearing were the quietest of Evelyn's time in Redstone, which was not the same as easy. The quiet had a specific texture to it, the texture of things being held in suspension, of people watching to see which way something would fall. She felt it in town on her Thursday supply runs, in the way conversation shifted when she walked into a room, in the careful neutrality of faces that hadn't yet decided which version of the story about her they were going to commit to. Harold Mercer had gone somewhat quiet too, which Garrett Hale told her was not reassuring. "A man like that goes quiet when he thinks he's already won," Garrett said, when he came through Redstone in the first week of January to finalize their preparation. They were sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread between them, and Evelyn was reading through her own proposed testimony for the 4th time, looking for places where emotion might override precision. "He's comfortable. That's not ideal." "What would make him less comfortable?" she said. "Realizing he doesn't have what he thinks he has." Garrett looked at his own notes. His case rests on community perception. If he's done a thorough job of building that perception over the past 3 months, the hearing could be worse than I'd like, even with what we have. He paused. "The Reeves girl. You're certain she'll hold?" "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitation. He looked at her over his papers. "I've talked to her every week for 6 weeks," Evelyn said. "She's not going to break. She's angry, genuinely angry, not the kind that cools down." "Good," he said. "Anger is more durable than courage, usually." She thought about that afterward, when Garrett had gone and the children were in bed and she was sitting with the papers in front of her. Anger is more durable than courage. She turned it over. She wasn't sure which one she was running on at this point. Maybe neither. Maybe just the grinding forward momentum of a woman who had too many things depending on her to consider stopping. Naomi came the day before the hearing. She arrived in the late afternoon when the light was going gold across the snow, and she looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days, which she hadn't. "My father is coming," she said before she'd even sat down. Evelyn looked at her. "To testify?" "To the hearing. He said he'll speak if it goes the way he thinks it'll go." She sat down heavily. He's not making promises, but he'll be there. Evelyn poured coffee, set it in front of Naomi. Is he all right? He's scared, Naomi said. He's been scared since October, but he said last night that being scared of Harold Mercer and letting Harold Mercer do whatever he wanted were two different things, and he was tired of acting like they were the same. She wrapped her hands around the cup. He said that. I didn't say it for him. He sounds like a good man, Evelyn said. He is, Naomi said. He's just been living in Mercer's shadow for so long he forgot what the sun looked like. They stayed at the table for another hour, going through what to expect, what Garrett had said about the order of proceedings, what Judge Aldridge was known to be like in a formal hearing. Naomi was as prepared as she was going to be. There was nothing left to add that wouldn't just be adding noise. When Naomi left, Evelyn stood on the cottage porch and watched her ride back down the road toward town. The evening was cold and completely still. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird called once and then went quiet. She went back inside. Thomas was at the small table in the main room, sharpening a knife by lamplight. Something he did when he couldn't settle, the same way his father used to repair harness when he was worried. Tomorrow's the day, he said without looking up. Yes. Are you scared? She sat down across from him. Yes, she said, because lying to Thomas had stopped being something she could do around the time he turned 12. He kept working the knife. What happens if it goes wrong? She looked at her son, at the lamp between them throwing its unsteady light, at his hands, which were Dennis's hands exactly, the same square knuckles, the same way of holding a tool like he understood it. If it goes wrong, we figure out the next thing, she said. That's all we've ever done. That's not a real answer, he said. No, she agreed, but it's the only honest one I have. He set the knife down, looked at her. I'll be there, he said. In the courtroom. I want to be there. I know. Is that all right? She considered it. He was 14. He was also, in most practical ways that mattered, older than that. Yes, she said. It's all right. He picked the knife back up. She went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours before sleep finally settled over her like something too tired to stay away any longer. January 14th arrived gray and very cold, the kind of cold that had been established for long enough that it felt permanent, like the world had simply decided to be this temperature from now on. She woke before dawn and lay still for a moment, listening to the cottage around her, the creak of the walls, James's breathing from the back room, the distant sound of the ranch already stirring. She dressed carefully. The best dress she had, dark blue wool, the one she'd packed from Indiana because it was good quality, and she'd known instinctively to keep something decent. She pinned her hair back properly for the first time in weeks. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and saw a woman who looked tired and determined and not quite like someone who had everything under control, which was honest and would have to do. She fed the children. She made sure Margaret knew the routine for the day. Lunch was already prepared, just needed warming, and Clara was to stay inside until the temperature came up, which it probably wouldn't, so Clara was to stay inside. Rhett was waiting at the main house with a wagon he'd had Thomas hitch before first light. He looked at her when she came out, a long, assessing look that she'd come to understand was him taking stock of a situation. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said, climbing up to the bench. "Let's go." The road into town was hard-packed with old snow. The horse's breath made clouds. They didn't talk much on the drive, which was its own kind of comfort. She'd never had to fill silence with Rhett, and she was grateful for that this morning, particularly. Thomas sat in the back of the wagon, straight-backed, watching the road. The courthouse in Redstone was the solidest building in town. Stone foundation, brick walls, built in the way of things that were meant to communicate permanence and authority. By the time they arrived, there were already people outside. More than she expected. Considerably more. She recognized some of them. Mrs. Fenton, standing near the door in her good coat, with the specific expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something. Eleanor Parrish, the schoolteacher, with 2 other women Evelyn knew slightly from town. Denny and 2 other ranch hands in clean clothes, looking slightly uncomfortable out of their work context but present. A family from the outlying area, the Hendersons, she thought, who she'd sent supplies to twice during the lean weeks of November. And others she didn't know as well. People who'd eaten the bread she sent through Mrs. Fenton's store. People who'd heard about the storm and what had happened in the main house that night. People who had apparently been watching the situation and forming their own conclusions independent of what Harold Mercer wanted them to conclude. She stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Mrs. Brooks. It was Mrs. Fenton coming toward her. There are people inside already. A lot of them. I want you to know, Harold Mercer did not expect this. How do you know? Evelyn said. Because I watched his face when he arrived and saw the crowd, Mrs. Fenton said, with a satisfaction that was not entirely charitable, but was entirely understandable. He looked like a man who'd set a fire and turned around to find the wind had shifted. She went inside. The courtroom was small by any standard. A county courthouse in a frontier town didn't have ambitions toward grandeur, but it was full. Benches on both sides, most of them occupied. Harold Mercer was seated at a table on the left side of the room, with a lawyer beside him who had the look of someone imported from somewhere with larger ambitions than Redstone. Mercer himself was composed in the way of a man who was used to being the most powerful person present. He watched Evelyn come in with the calm attentiveness of a card player. She went to the table on the right side where Garrett Hale was already seated with his papers organized. She sat. The room is more full than I expected, Garrett said quietly. Same, she said. That's either very good or complicated, he said. We'll find out which. Judge Aldridge entered from the side door at 9 o'clock exactly. He was a lean man in his 60s, unhurried, with a face that had been weathered into something resembling patience. He looked at the room, at the crowd on the benches, at both tables, at the papers before him, and took it all in without visible reaction. This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of the welfare petition filed by Harold D. Mercer regarding the minor children of Evelyn M. Brooks, he said, in a voice that carried without effort. The purpose of today's hearing is to determine whether sufficient grounds exist for formal proceedings. This is not a trial. It is a hearing. I will treat it accordingly, and I expect all parties to do the same. He looked out over the room. We'll begin. Mercer's lawyer went first. His name was Aldous Crane, and he was smooth in a way that was professionally calibrated. The kind of smooth that was designed to feel like reason while doing something less than reasonable. He laid out the petition's concerns in organized, temperate language. The environment, the ambiguity of domestic arrangements, the suitability of a working cattle ranch as a residence for young children, the question of moral clarity. He didn't say anything directly inflammatory. He didn't need to. He just arranged implication like furniture and let the room furnish the rest. Evelyn watched the judge while Crane talked. Aldridge listened with the same weathered patience he'd walked in with. He took notes occasionally. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them procedural. When Crane finished, Garrett stood. He was less polished than Crane, more direct, with a slight plain-spokenness that was either natural or very cleverly deployed. He introduced the documentation first. The written record of the children's weekly education, the letter from Eleanor Parrish, the letter from 2 other community members, the medical account of Clara's and James's good health, verified by the doctor who passed through Redstone monthly. He laid each document on the table in front of the judge, and the judge read each one with care. Then the witnesses. Eleanor Parrish spoke first, in the clear, organized manner of a woman accustomed to being listened to in rooms where she had to establish her credibility without help. She described what she'd observed of the children, their manners, their literacy, the way they carried themselves. She said near the end, I have been teaching in this territory for 11 years, and I have seen children in circumstances that concerned me genuinely. These children are not among them. She said it without drama, just as a fact, the way professionals state fact. Denny was next. He was less comfortable in the setting. He sat with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere around the middle distance. But what he said was simple and unassailable. He'd worked at Callaway Ranch for 6 years. He'd seen the children every day. They were fed, healthy, cared for, and the mother worked harder than most men he knew and never neglected them doing it. He said this last part in the careful, slightly formal language of a man trying to say something important precisely, and it landed precisely. 3 more witnesses. Each one clear, each one specific, each one giving the judge something concrete rather than atmospheric. Then a pause. Mercer's lawyer made a brief, smooth interjection about the credibility of ranch employees as objective witnesses, and Judge Aldridge noted it with the expression of a man filing something in a drawer labeled possibly relevant, probably not. Then Garrett said, "I'd like to call Naomi Reeves." The room shifted. It was subtle, the particular stillness of a space where attention has just been pulled in one direction. Evelyn felt, rather than saw, Harold Mercer go very slightly still at the table to her left. Naomi came forward from the second bench. She was wearing a plain dark dress, and she was pale in the way of someone who had been living with something difficult for a while and had run out of the capacity to pretend otherwise. She sat in the witness chair and looked at Garrett, not at Mercer. Garrett took her through it carefully. Who she was, her connection to Redstone, her father's business, how her father had come to be at the meeting in Mercer's office in October, what had been discussed at that meeting. She answered in the clear, deliberate voice of someone who had rehearsed not for performance but for accuracy. She wanted to get every detail right, and she did. When she described Mercer's specific statement about the petition, about using it to attach scandal to Callaway Ranch as a weakening mechanism before challenging the property claim, the room went quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of a formal proceeding. It was the quiet of people recalibrating. Mercer's lawyer stood before she was done. "Objection," he said, in a voice that had lost some of its smoothness. "This is hearsay. The witness is describing a conversation she personally heard," Garrett said. "That's direct testimony, not hearsay. The question of its credibility is for the judge to assess." Judge Aldridge looked at both of them. "Sit down, Mr. Crane," he said. He said it quietly, which was more effective than loudly. Crane sat. Naomi finished. Garrett said, "I'd also like to note for the record that Naomi Reeves's father, Mr. Arthur Reeves, is present in this courtroom and available to corroborate his daughter's testimony if the court finds it warranted." The judge looked out at the benches. Arthur Reeves, a stocky, gray-haired man in the third row who looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 3 months, raised his hand briefly, steady. He raised it steadily. "Noted," the judge said. Mercer's lawyer made a rapid and slightly disorganized attempt to reframe what had just been introduced. He challenged Naomi's account on grounds that shifted twice mid-argument, which did not help him. He tried to redirect toward the original petition concerns, but the original petition concerns had been answered thoroughly enough that returning to them now felt like a retreat rather than a rally. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She stood and walked to the front of the room with her hands loose at her sides. She'd thought about this moment for 8 weeks. She'd written out what she wanted to say a dozen times and thrown it out a dozen times because it kept coming out either too defensive or too careful, and neither of those was right. The night before, very late, she'd finally understood what she actually needed to say, and it was simpler than everything she'd written. "Mrs. Brooks," Garrett said, "can you describe in your own words what stability means for your family?" She looked at the judge. Not at the room. Not at Mercer. "It means they're fed," she said. "Not once in a while, every day, and enough. It means they're warm at night. It means the older ones are learning and the younger ones are learning at their own pace, and nobody's being neglected for the sake of something else." She paused. "It means that when things go wrong, and things go wrong constantly, that's just the nature of things. They have a mother who doesn't quit, who finds the next solution, who gets back up the next morning and keeps going." She felt her voice stay level, which cost something. "I brought my children a long way because the alternative was staying somewhere with no future and hoping for one. I found work. I earned it. I've kept it. And my children are better off today than they were 6 months ago, and they'll be better off 6 months from now because I have never once stopped working toward that." She stopped. Let it settle. That's what stability means. The room was very quiet. Not the polite quiet of a proceeding. The different, denser quiet of a room full of people who've heard something that resonated with something they already knew. Judge Aldridge wrote something down. Mercer's lawyer had one final attempt. He was visibly working to regain momentum, and the effort showed, which was its own problem. He made a point about the original nature of the petition, about the community's expressed concerns, about the court's responsibility to weigh those concerns seriously. Judge Aldridge listened. Then Harold Mercer did something that surprised almost everyone in the room. He stood up. His lawyer turned, clearly not expecting this. Mercer put a hand on his shoulder. Sit down, the gesture said, and the lawyer sat. Mercer looked at the judge. Harold, his lawyer said in a low, warning voice. Mercer ignored him. I'd like to say something, he said to the judge. This is irregular, Judge Aldridge said. I understand that, Mercer said. I'd still like to say it. The judge considered. Briefly. Mercer looked at the room. He was still composed. The man had a remarkable capacity for composure, but there was something different underneath it now. The room had not gone the way he'd planned, and he knew it, and he was making a decision in real time about how to respond to that. I had concerns about this situation, he said. I filed a petition because I believed those concerns were legitimate. He paused. I have heard testimony today that has led me to reconsider certain aspects of my understanding of the situation. It was not an apology. It was the farthest Harold Mercer was capable of moving in the direction of an apology while still remaining Harold Mercer. But what it was, more importantly, was a retreat. The room understood it as a retreat. His lawyer had his eyes closed. Garrett Hale was looking at his papers with the expression of a man who had learned over years of legal practice not to show satisfaction prematurely. The judge looked at Mercer for a long moment. Thank you for that statement, Mr. Mercer, he said, in a voice that communicated clearly what he thought of its timing. He turned back to his papers. He wrote for a minute. The room was silent enough that the scratch of his pen was audible. This court finds no grounds for formal proceedings in the matter of the welfare of the minor children of Evelyn M. Brooks, he said. The petition is dismissed. The children remain in the care of their mother. He set his pen down. If there are concerns about the improper use of this court's process for purposes unrelated to child welfare, I would encourage the relevant parties to consider that such matters have a way of drawing further scrutiny. He said it without inflection, which made it more pointed than shouting would have. He closed the file. We're adjourned. The sound that went through the room was not a cheer, but it was something quieter and more complex than that. A collective exhale. People beginning to move and talk. The release of something that had been held in for a long time. Garrett set his papers down and turned to Evelyn. Well, he said. Yes, she said. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat on the table and took a breath and let the shaking run its course. Garrett politely looked elsewhere. Across the room, Harold Mercer was talking in a low, tight voice to his lawyer, who appeared to be explaining something that Mercer did not want explained. Mercer's composure had held, but it had the quality of a structure that's held through something it wasn't built for. Intact, but you could see where the stress had gone. He didn't look at Evelyn. She didn't need him to. Mrs. Fenton appeared at her elbow, and then Eleanor Parrish, and then Denny was there, hat in hand again, and he said nothing at all, but he nodded at her in the particular way of a man expressing something he doesn't have the words for, and she nodded back. Thomas pushed through the crowd and stood in front of her. He was trying very hard to hold his face in the neutral, steady expression of a 14-year-old boy who was not going to do something embarrassing in a public place. He was not entirely succeeding. She put her hand on his shoulder. Okay, she said. Yeah, he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. He cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling briefly. Yeah, okay. Outside, the cold hit like a physical thing after the warmth of the crowded courtroom. People were coming out around them, conversations spilling down the courthouse steps. The sky had gone from gray to something almost clear, pale winter blue at the edges, where the clouds were breaking up. Naomi found her on the steps. Her face had some color back in it. Beside her, Arthur Reeves, her father, stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at Evelyn with the carefully maintained dignity of a man who had done something he was proud of and didn't quite know how to say so. Mr. Reeves, Evelyn said. He nodded. Mrs. Brooks. He looked out at the street, then back at her. I should have done more, sooner. You did what you could, she said. That's a kind way to say it. He paused. It's not entirely accurate. She held his gaze. No, she said, because she wasn't going to lie to him about it. But you came today. That matters. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded again, and moved off down the steps with Naomi at his side. Rhett was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps with the wagon. He'd been in the courtroom. She'd known he was there, had been aware of him in the back row without looking directly at him. But he hadn't spoken during the proceedings, which was the right call, and she'd known he'd make it. He was looking at her with that particular steadiness of his, the one that didn't have an obvious emotion attached to it, but that she'd learned over these months communicated something she might not have a word for yet. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. She climbed up to the wagon bench. Thomas got in the back. Rhett unwrapped the reins. The horse moved forward, out into the street, past the people on the courthouse steps, past Mrs. Fenton, who raised a hand as they passed, past the barber shop and the general store and the saloon and the school and all the places that had watched Evelyn Brooks arrive with nothing and had waited to see what would happen next. She rode through Redstone and didn't look back. The ranch was 4 miles east, and the road was clear, and the sky at the horizon was the pale, specific blue of a winter afternoon that hadn't decided yet whether it would be beautiful. She let it be open. She let the road roll under the wagon wheels, and the cold air move around her and her son in the back, and the man beside her not saying anything because he didn't need to. And she let herself feel, for the first time since October, something in the vicinity of relief, not victory. Relief was smaller and more honest than victory, and she was a person who preferred the honest version of things. She had her children, she had her work, she had the spring and the kitchen garden and the fence Thomas was going to help her build against the deer. She had, she thought, more than she'd arrived with, which was, in the end, all she'd ever asked for. The days after the hearing had a different quality to them, not easier exactly. The work was the same, the mornings were just as cold, the children were just as loud, and the kitchen didn't stop needing to run because a judge had dismissed a petition. But the air had changed. Something that had been pressing against the walls of everything for 3 months had lifted, and the absence of it was noticeable in the way that the absence of a constant sound is noticeable. You only understood how much it had been there once it was gone. She noticed it first in herself. The particular tightness she'd been carrying across her shoulders since October loosened, not all at once but incrementally, the way ice melts. From the edges in, slowly, over days. She slept differently. Not better necessarily, but differently. Less vigilant, less braced for whatever the next thing would be. She noticed it next in the town. The shift in Redstone was not dramatic. Small towns don't reverse themselves dramatically. They move like slow water, adjusting the channel degree by degree until one day you look up and the whole course has changed. But it moved. Mrs. Fenton reported that the bread sold out faster than ever on Thursdays, and that 3 women who'd been part of the ambient coldness toward Evelyn had come into the store separately asking how she was. Not to gossip, actually asking. Eleanor Parrish stopped her on the street 2 weeks after the hearing and said, without preamble, "I'd like the children to attend the school properly, starting in February. Samuel particularly. His reading is almost where it should be, and a few months with other students will get him there." She said it in the decisive manner of a woman who had made up her mind and was informing rather than requesting. Evelyn said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. Harold Mercer was a different matter. He didn't disappear. Men like Harold Mercer didn't disappear from the towns they'd spent 30 years building their position in. But he diminished. The process was quiet and not particularly dramatic, which was somehow more complete than a dramatic fall would have been. The 2 council members who'd been reliably in his corner began finding reasons to establish independent opinions on things. The third one, who'd been the least certain of his allies, started sitting on the opposite side of the room at public meetings. The lawyer, Aldous Crane, left Redstone on the 21st of January and didn't come back, which told its own story about who'd been paying his retainer. The property claim Mercer had reportedly been building against the ranch, the personal debt he'd claimed Thaddeus Calloway owed him, was never filed. Garrett Hale had told Evelyn this was likely because without the destabilizing cloud of scandal to weaken Rhett's standing, the claim would need actual documentation to survive scrutiny, and documentation of something that hadn't happened was difficult to manufacture convincingly. Arthur Reeves's business, which Mercer had historically helped sustain through referrals and informal agreements, lost some of that support over the following weeks. But the town picked up part of the slack. People who respected what Arthur had done in the courtroom and what Naomi had done before it found reasons to spend money at Reeves' Dry Goods. It wasn't organized. Nobody announced it. It was just the quiet way a community sometimes decides to correct for something. Evelyn heard this from Mrs. Fenton, who heard everything worth hearing. "You know what's interesting?" Mrs. Fenton said one Thursday. wrapping a package across the counter with her usual brisk efficiency. People don't talk about what Mercer's doing anymore. They talk about what they're doing, what they're planning. There's a difference. Evelyn considered this. He gave them something to push against, she said. And when people push against something and the something moves, they feel capable. That feeling stays. Mrs. Fenton looked at her over the package. That's a perceptive thing to say. It's just something I've noticed, Evelyn said, about how things change. She'd noticed it about herself too, though she was slower to say so. She had arrived in Redstone believing, with the tight practicality of a woman who'd been surviving for a long time, that the only person she could depend on was herself. That help came with conditions and community came with cost, and the safest position was the one where you needed the fewest people. She still believed parts of that, but she believed it less completely than she had in October. Naomi had stood up in a courtroom for a woman she barely knew. Denny had spoken in front of a judge with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the middle distance and said plainly what he'd seen. Eleanor Parrish had written a letter and then shown up in person. Mrs. Fenton had reported the truth for 3 months when the easier thing would have been silence. None of them had needed to. None of them had done it because they wanted something from her in return. She turned that over for a while. She wasn't sure what to do with it, exactly. Gratitude was an emotion she had a complicated relationship with, because gratitude implied vulnerability, and she'd spent years treating vulnerability like a liability. But she was 37 years old, and she'd been wrong about things before, and she was capable of updating. She started by saying thank you more directly than she usually allowed herself to. She went to Eleanor Parrish and said it properly. She went to Arthur Reeves, which was a slightly harder conversation. He was still carrying some weight of his own guilt over having taken so long to act, and she told him that what he'd done had mattered. She meant it, and he could tell she meant it, which seemed to help him more than absolution would have. To Naomi, she said less and did more. She found out that Naomi had quietly wanted to study. She had a particular interest in law, which surprised nobody who'd watched her in that courtroom. And Evelyn wrote a letter to a women's college in the East that she'd read about, the kind of letter that said what Naomi had done and who she was. And she sent it with a recommendation from Garrett Hale, who'd been sufficiently impressed by Naomi's testimony to add his name without being asked twice. She didn't tell Naomi she'd done it until the letter had gone. Naomi looked at her when she found out, just looked at her for a moment. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, Evelyn agreed. I wanted to. February arrived, and with it the tentative first suggestion that winter might eventually end. Not yet, not close to yet, but the days were fractionally longer, and on the clearest afternoons the sunlight had a different angle to it, higher and more direct, and you could stand in the south-facing doorway of the cottage and feel it on your face with something that was almost warmth. She started planning the kitchen garden. She walked the south side of the cottage with Thomas on a Sunday afternoon, both of them in their heavy coats, their breath making clouds, the ground still iron-hard with frost. She'd been thinking about the layout since before the hearing. It was the thing she'd let herself think about when she needed to think about something that wasn't the hearing. Where the rows would go, what she'd put in first, what needed the longest season, how close to the wall to plant the things that wanted the reflected heat. Here, she said, stopping at a point about 8 feet from the cottage wall. The fence line should start here. We'll go out about 20 feet, back across, and along the wall. Thomas looked at the ground, calculating. I'll need posts. 8, maybe 10. I'll ask Rhett. The deer are bad in March, Thomas said. When the snow's still on the ground and the browse is low, whatever we build needs to hold then. She looked at her son, this boy who had grown up faster than she'd wanted him to, who knew about deer browse patterns and fence posts and when to bring the horses in, who had arrived in Redstone exhausted and scared behind a face that was trying very hard not to show it, and who had become, over 6 months, someone she could actually rely on in the way you rely on people whose judgment you trust. When did you learn about deer? She said. Denny, he said, without looking up. He talks when we're working. He knows a lot. He does, she said. They stayed out a while longer, marking the corners of the garden with sticks pushed into the frozen ground. It looked small, marked out like that, smaller than the garden she'd had in Indiana, which had fed them through hard summers and been the thing she'd been sorriest to leave. But it was real ground, and it was hers to plant, and in 6 weeks the frost would start coming out of it. That was enough to work with. The conversation with Rhett happened in early March. It came without announcement, the way real conversations usually did, slipping in through a gap in an ordinary evening. She'd brought supper up to the main house because there was more counter space, and she'd been making a large batch of preserves, and they'd eaten, and the kitchen had gone quiet the way it did after meals, and she was washing up at the basin when he said, from the table where he was still sitting with his coffee, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to actually think about it before you answer." She turned and looked at him. He had the expression of a man who'd been preparing something, not for performance, but because he'd wanted to say it right and had taken the time to figure out how. "I know what you said in December," he said. "I'm not asking the same question. I'm asking a different one." She waited. "I'm asking whether you think two people who've built something together might want to keep building it," he said. "Not because one of them needs saving, not because it's practical, because it makes sense, and they both know it makes sense, and the reason they haven't said so is that one of them is stubborn and the other one is worse." She looked at him for a long moment. "Which one am I?" she said. "Worse," he said. She felt something move across her face that was probably a smile, though it came out complicated. She turned back to the basin. He was quiet, not an uncomfortable quiet, the patient quiet of a man who had said what he wanted to say and was willing to wait for the response it deserved. She thought about December, about what she'd said then and why she'd said it, and whether those reasons still held in exactly the same shape they'd held then. She thought about the garden and the fence posts and the spring that was coming in 6 weeks. She thought about Clara in the stable, learning to hold her hand flat so the horse could take the carrot safely. She thought about this kitchen, which she'd walked into 8 months ago as a stranger, and which she now knew the way you know rooms that have become yours. Every quirk of the stove, every shelf, every creak of the floorboard by the door. She dried her hands on the cloth by the basin. "I want something understood," she said, turning around. He looked at her. "I run the kitchen the way I run the kitchen," she said. "I make my own decisions about my children. If I think something's wrong, I say so, and I expect to be listened to. Not obeyed, listened to. There's a difference." "I know the difference," he said. "And I'm not changing my name," she said. It came out before she'd fully decided it, but it was true when it came out. He was quiet for a second, then, "All right." "All right," she said. "That surprised you," he said. "Slightly," she admitted. "I'm not marrying you for your name," he said, in the flat, exact way he said things he'd already decided. "I don't need it. What I want is—" He stopped, looked at the table, then back at her, which cost him something. "What I want is you. Here. Not because I'm offering you something, because I want to keep doing this, and I think you do too, and I'd rather say it plainly than spend another 6 months pretending I don't." She stood at the basin and looked at this man who was, in his way, the least romantic person she'd ever met in her life, and who had just said something more honest and more direct than most men managed with flowers and poetry. She walked back to the table and sat down across from him. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "That's it?" she said. "You're just going to nod?" "I figured nodding was better than saying something that ruins it," he said. She laughed, actually laughed. The real kind, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded. It surprised both of them. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something open and slightly undefended, and then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. And that was all, just that. But she felt it settle into her like the first warm day after a very long winter. They married in April, on a Wednesday, because Wednesday was the day with the most light and the least ranch work that couldn't wait. It was not a large event. The judge who'd handled the hearing, a different judge, a civil matter, a quick and practical ceremony, and Mrs. Fenton as witness, and Garrett Hale, who happened to be in town on other business and seemed genuinely pleased, and the children, which was the important part. Clara wore a dress with a blue ribbon that Margaret had found somewhere and tied herself, somewhat asymmetrically. James lost one of his good shoes in the mud behind the courthouse and arrived with one boot and one sock, which was discovered at the last moment and resolved with a borrowed boot from Thomas that was 4 sizes too large and had to be stuffed with rags. Samuel cried, which he denied immediately, and continued to deny for the rest of his natural life. Thomas stood next to Evelyn with his hands clasped in front of him, And at one point during the ceremony, she glanced sideways at him, and he was looking at Rhett with the careful, assessing expression of a 14-year-old boy deciding something about a man, and then he looked at her and gave a small single nod. It was the best thing anyone gave her that day. After, they went back to the ranch. The kitchen garden was already planted. She'd started it in the first week of March, as soon as the ground allowed, with Thomas's fence installed against the deer and the first seeds in by the 15th. Onions, potatoes, beans, the herbs she'd been missing since Indiana, a row of root vegetables along the south wall where the reflected heat would help them. It wasn't much yet, just turned earth and small markers indicating what was where, but it was alive, starting. That evening, she cooked supper in the ranch house kitchen, as she always did, and the ranch hands came in for the meal, as they always did. And it was completely ordinary in the way that some of the best evenings are. Just people sitting down to eat, just food on a table, just the particular noise of a working household at the end of a working day. Denny said grace over his plate in the silent way he always did, head bowed for a second. Wade passed the bread without being asked and said, "Good crust tonight," which was his version of a standing ovation. Clara, who was seated between James and the ranch hand named Cale, whose frostbitten fingers had healed cleanly, leaving him with a slight sensitivity to cold that he managed by wrapping that hand in winter and ignoring it otherwise, was telling Cale with great authority about the correct way to plant beans. "You have to put them in with the seam down," she said. "Mama says." "Is that so?" Cale said, with the patience of a man who'd been educated by a 5-year-old before and had made his peace with it. "It's very important," Clara said. Evelyn looked down the table. At all of it. At the specific ordinary chaos of a full table, people talking over each other. The sound of forks on plates, Red at the head of the table with his particular way of listening to everything while appearing to focus on nothing. Thomas helping himself to a second serving of potatoes without asking because he'd reached the age where asking felt unnecessary. Margaret correcting Samuel's table manners with the weary authority of a much older sibling. She'd arrived in Redstone with 5 children and a sack of food on her shoulder, in a town that saw a burden and a man who'd almost turned her away from his door. She hadn't known, that first evening, whether she was making a decision or a mistake. She'd been too tired for certainty and too determined to let the absence of it stop her. She'd just done the next necessary thing, and then the next one, and then the one after that, in the way that people who can't afford to stop don't stop. She didn't think of it as strength, particularly. She'd heard that word applied to her these past months, and it always landed slightly wrong. Strength implied she'd had a choice between pushing forward and not. She wasn't sure she had. She was built the way she was built, the same way the ranch house was built, for function, for weathering, not for display. What she'd learned or relearned was something different, not about her own capacity, which she'd always known was sufficient, about everyone else's. People were capable of more than they showed, of more courage, more decency, more willingness to do the uncomfortable thing for the right reason. Naomi at 19 walking into a courtroom, Arthur Reeves raising his hand steadily, Denny in his clean clothes with his hat in his hands finding the right words. Even Wade carrying flour sacks without being asked, arriving at a version of himself that had more dignity in it than the one he'd started with. The town was not transformed. That was the other thing she understood now that she hadn't entirely understood before. Transformation was a dramatic word for a modest reality. Redstone was still Redstone. It still had its complications, and its small-mindedness, and its people who would have stood on the wrong side of things if the wind had blown differently. Harold Mercer was still there, reduced but not gone, recalibrating in the way of men who know how to survive their own defeats. But something had shifted in the way the town understood itself. What was possible in it? Who could be part of it, and on what terms? That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, what slow and genuine change actually looked like. Not a revolution, just a recalibration, degree by degree, until the channel runs differently. She'd been part of that. Not alone, not as any kind of hero, but as a woman who had shown up and refused to perform smallness when smallness was expected of her, and had made it hard for the people around her to perform it either. Claire was now telling Cale about the beans she expected to harvest in summer, and how many, and what Mama was going to do with them, with the confidence of someone for whom all future plans are simply facts waiting to be lived. Evelyn looked at her youngest daughter, fearless, directionally challenged, absolutely certain of her place in the world, and felt something she didn't try to name because some things are more complete when they're just felt, without the reduction of language. Across the table, Rhett caught her eye. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked back at her plate and ate her supper. Outside, the April evening was coming down soft and clear across Redstone County, the sky going from blue to gold to something that didn't have a name, the kind of sky that sits above a place and makes it look, briefly, exactly like what it is. Just a stretch of earth where people have decided to make something last. The woman who had arrived with nothing had built something she hadn't even known how to want when she started. Not a perfect life, there was no such accounting, and she was too honest a person to call it that. But a real one, a life with texture and difficulty, and people who showed up in work that mattered, and a table full of noise at the end of every day. That was the whole of it, the honest whole of it. And it was by any fair measure enough.